This is our chemistry lab tutorial on conducting a distillation. So you may ask, what is a distillation? It's a separation technique based on boiling point. So the idea that every liquid has a different boiling point is what we can use to help us with the separation. You can isolate different liquids from a mixture of liquids. So if you know you've got a mixture that has more than one component in it in terms of the amount of liquids it has, you can try to separate those back out based off of their different boiling points. It's essential in the petroleum industry. So how do we get the gasoline that you know when you go to get gas in your car versus other types of alcohol and petroleum products that we would interact with? You can also think of it in the word distilled water. So if you go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of water and it says distilled on it, that's what we're talking about here. So what does the setup look like for a distillation? Well, this is a setup that we will be using in the chemistry classroom this year. So you can see that there's a lot of components involved to it, and it looks kind of complicated when you first look at it, but what we're going to do here is we're going to really try to break it down and figure out the different pieces of equipment that are needed and how to set them up in a reasonable and logical order. So let's break it down. What materials are needed? You need round bottom flasks, which is something that's new. We'll use two different sizes, one's bigger than the other. Glassware clamps, thermometer and an adapter for a thermometer, condenser, support for the glassware including ring stands and clamps, and a heat source as well as tubing, and you'll see why we need those, specifically two pieces of tubing. So the equipment explanation we're going to start with is for a round bottom flask. So these are our two round bottom flasks that you'll be using. So we have a 100 ml and a 250 ml Pyrex round bottom flask. So they are called round bottom flasks because they are indeed round on the bottom. So this round shape is important because it's more resistant to fracturing. That's because the round shape helps just evenly distribute stress as it gets heated and so forth. Also allows for more uniform heating. There's just a wider surface that the heat can be applied more evenly. So in terms of the next piece of equipment, these glassware clamps, they look like this, the ones that we'll be using. They have this blue color, and you'll notice that they have two kind of ring parts to them that you can use to help you attach them, as well as the little support clamps on the side. So we obviously need to support the glassware during heating. First of all, it's very expensive. Second of all, if it breaks in the middle of your distillation, you're going to have to start over. These clamps allow for the joint to be supported so the glass does not slip at this point. The thermometer, pretty self-explanatory, look like this. We measure in Celsius in chemistry. And that's a little adapter that we use to help seal off the joint, because if you think about it, you're going to put a thermometer in, there has to be an opening for that. We want to make sure that nothing can escape in this opening. So distillations require careful attention to the heating process since we are trying to track those boiling points, so quite literally the temperature at which that liquid boils. And then the thermometer again uses that adapter to seal off the apparatus to make sure that none of the gas vapors escape through the hole that the thermometer is being placed in. That hole perfectly fits to that thermometer so that there's no room for any of the gases to escape, which would affect your data and your process in general. The placement is important. We'll get to that when we do some videos of how to set this up, but just keep in mind that it is going to matter where you put the thermometer and how far into the apparatus itself it goes. The next piece of equipment that's new is called a condenser. So the condenser looks like this, and it technically has some joints to it already, but the main definition of the condenser is that middle part with the two valves that come off the top. We'll talk about how we're going to set that up and use it, but it's the connection glassware that basically allows for the liquid to go from one round bottom flask to the other. And the water will also run through this piece of glassware, and you'll see what that looks like in a little bit, but that's why there's those two valves at the top. This piece is essential in having the gas condense back to a liquid because this is what will allow the gas to be exposed to a colder temperature, which will make it then condense to a liquid. In terms of supporting the glassware even more, we need to have ring stands. So like that picture there, we will have two of them. And clamps, again, we will use two of those as well. That's just to stabilize the glassware because the glassware is really important. It's why this whole thing can work. And it needs the support again so it doesn't break, which means you'd have to start over, as well as the fact that it is really expensive. In terms of the heat source that we will use a heat source that looks like this, okay? It's not the most modern piece of heat source, but it works pretty well. So you need heat to vaporize the liquid. You need to heat up the liquid to create it, to cause it to evaporate into a gas, which is at the core of this process. We obviously need a rounded heat source. since the round bottom flask is being used, so you'll see in this picture of the heat source, there's a rounded kind of sloped area, and that's what will allow it to perfectly hold the round bottom flask itself. In terms of the materials, what we're going to do next is we are going to look at like a little video clip of these being supported themselves, right, in the lab setting, so that way we can try to understand how to set this up. So when preparing to do a distillation, the first thing you want to do is gather all of your materials like we have here. Okay, we've got our heater on the left. I do have it plugged in. That whiteboard's there just to help us see the glassware once we get this set up. We've got our condenser, our thermometer with the adapter. We've got 2 clamps, 2 support stands with the ring stands there. We've got 2 of the little blue clamps for the glassware, and we've got the 2 round bottom flasks as well as 2 pieces of tubing that we're going to use for our water.